Okay, then it's Jem, Bendell, and Matthew Slater. Oh, okay. Yeah, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
F5 to start the PowerPoint.
Say that again?
How do I start the PowerPoint?
Is this not your...
This is it. I just didn't know how to start it.
Probably with this one, I think.
So, good afternoon. My name's Jem Bendell. I'm a professor in the UK at the University of Cumbria. And presenting with me is Matthew Slater, community currency engineer and co-founder of Community Forge. I just want to say a few words of context before handing over to Matthew to do the presentation proper. So our paper submitted for the conference is called Thwarting an Uber Future for Complementary Currencies, subtitled Open Protocols for a Credit Commons. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we mean to convey with that in a moment. But this paper is the third paper that Matthew and I have written together over the last few years, and it stems from a collaboration that started about 7 years ago. What's really good about this conference is that it brings together researchers and practitioners in dialogue. And I think that's key because often in social science we see researchers viewing the world of practice from somewhat conceptually from afar and seeing that if they bring more of themselves into their research, then that somehow compromises or pollutes the quality of the research. So I see that as something of a hangover of positivist reductionist notions from natural science. And in the university I work at, we have quite a different tradition because we work on something called professional learning. So basically it's a university that has a long track record in educating nurses and teachers and other public servants like the police. And so what our university is quite specialized in is helping a practitioner become a more reflective practitioner, helping a practitioner in nursing or in education better study their own practice. So it's called professional learning. And so when I came across that, I realized that I know quite a lot of practitioners who are actually involved in that. And although their practice isn't so well defined as, say, nursing, because their field is very much evolving and they see themselves as activists, what they're really doing is something quite similar. And I realized also that the conversation that I'd had with Matthew over 7 years was very much framed by one consistent research question. It's basically what we always talked about, which is how can there be a step change in the use of complementary currency in ways that will promote positive social change? And no matter what we talked about, it was framed in that context. And so then I realized that actually in some ways, through dialogue, there was a form of knowledge production going on, and therefore that's how we've written it up, and I sort of invented a term for a methodology of thinking partnership, which to describe what we've been doing. So that's the context in terms of how I see it methodologically as valid knowledge to share as an academic paper. In the paper, we use the term the commons, so I just want to mention what we mean by that. The commons is a term for describing sets of resources that a community recognises as being accessible to any member, so long as they abide by certain rules of access. And so you might think of a public right-of-way, but of course in the digital space we see what that means with the digital commons. So we're very much connected to that tradition in the history of the internet, and that's a core theme running through our work. In the paper, we also discuss the rift, or the two worlds that really aren't talking together in academia. So I did a literature review to look at what's been written, an interdisciplinary literature review using the kind of academic databases open to most academics, to look at what's been written about cryptographic currency. And then I compared that with what's been written about complementary currency in mainstream journals. And we see very little of either of those sides talking about each other. And of course, that's because cryptographic currency and blockchain is also quite a new field. But that academic rift also represents, I think, a rift in practice, in that this is quite an unusual session, in that you've got people talking about both sort of community-level complementary currency and people talking about the latest advances in blockchain and cryptographic currency. So I think in this paper, you can look at it if you want to see that literature review, but we think that unless the people in research and in practice in complementary currencies become aware of what's happening in the blockchain and the cryptographic space, and actually think ahead about the trends and where this might end up, then we will be almost less than a footnote in the history of a multiple currency future. And when we talk about thwarting an uber future in complementary currencies, we're seeing parallels now with what happened some years ago, where everyone got very excited about the sharing economy and people sharing couches in each other's house and so on. And then, obviously, major venture capital-backed startups seeking to be unicorns, multi-billion-dollar companies, that part of their whole fundraising strategy was based on the promise of monopolizing their sector. And so we can see that may well happen here. And of course, if you monopolize complementary currencies on a few platforms, then that will give incredible power to fairly unaccountable institutions. So that's what we're trying to get at with this paper. So that's some broad context. And now I'd like to hand over to Matthew to talk us through what he's actually doing about this. Matthew.
Thank you, Jem, for so much. And I also want to thank the organisers of the conference, because over the years, and this is the third conference I've been to, the third one I've been to, more and more space has been made available for practitioners, and this time I was even lucky to receive a scholarship to be here. So thank you on behalf of, I thank you. If you could pass it on to the organisers.
Always.
I posted this blog post about 3 or 4 years ago, in which I listed all the community exchange platforms I could possibly think of, or which I'd come across over the last few years. And there were quite a few, and there are many more in the actual blog post, and I continue to keep it updated. And it's interesting that many of them no longer exist. They have different business models, different currencies. They don't all have currencies, and different technologies behind them. I need to get closer, please. Because I'm looking at the slide over here. So they all have different technologies and business models and currencies and user experiences behind them. But many of them have disappeared completely from view. Very few of them were open source. And when they disappear from view, that means that there's really nothing left that we can build on after they've gone. And on the subject of monopolies that Jem mentioned, this whole field of exchange and the question of what is it that we can exchange with each other, it lends itself to one of these monopolies, but it's never actually been taken up and monopolized yet in the sharing economy, perhaps because they're focused on very, very narrow slices, like the spare bedrooms slice of the sharing economy. Or if you go to New York, there's an app for everything, and it's tiny, tiny slices. So I'm sure you've all come across Albert Einstein's definition of insanity. doing the same thing over and over again and expecting something different. I've only been doing this for 8 years, and as I say, coming to 3 conferences, but there's a lot, I feel, of people doing the same thing and expecting a different result. There are many, many projects starting up. They emerge out of the blue, they launch themselves in social media. There's a lot of buzz, and then a few months later you wonder, or I used to wonder, oh, I wonder what happened to them. And then you go to the website and you dig around and there's nothing going on. And they've completely gone, very often spending or even wasting venture capital, or if not, human and social capital in the process. And I have a strong feeling that there isn't learning going on, as many people realize that it's easy to have a revelation about the nature of money and to realize that what we need to do is exchange better amongst ourselves. And then it's only natural that one should want to build a platform to facilitate that. And so these platforms are all built, and then they stand alone, isolated, in search of users very often. There's a quote from a famous Kevin Costner movie, "Build it and they will come." And this seems to be the attitude embodied by very many people in the tech sector, and encouraged especially by venture capital, in which you receive the money to build it in the promise of getting users later. But it leads to very, very high-risk investments and very high failure rates, which is, of course, all factored in for the venture capital. But as a social movement, we might not have as much debt-based money to throw around and waste and risk as in these other business models. And so I'm interested in another approach to building platforms and widely facilitating exchange, which is not build it and they will come, but go where the energy is. And where I've always seen the energy is in the Let's and time banking movements. So there are many, many startups with different designs and different innovation, but you can hardly capture them or communicate with them before they disappear. But in the Let's and time banking movements, they've been around for 2-3 decades, maybe even more. They're very consistent. They're often conservative. They might not be my ideal chosen working partners sometimes, but I've always stuck with attempting to support them because they are there, they continue to be there, and they continue to subsist. So that's been my strategy: go where the energy is and support the existing momentum. I like to make these biological metaphors because they're very, very hard to contradict. So here's a picture of a multicellular organism, and what happens in the process of biological evolution. You have a cell which is self-contained, it has borders, and it has its own inner life. And some of those cells, sometimes under certain circumstances, come together and cooperate in a miraculous way, truly. And a single cellular organism cooperating becomes a multicellular organism. And the different cells develop specialities, and it develops its own membrane very often, like our skin is made up of many cells, but the skin is the border that separates the inside and outside of me, which is a multicellular organism. And looking at the complementary currency movement, I'm not really seeing this coming together, this evolution which I would expect and hope to see. What I'm seeing instead is these separate projects which spring up, and they have their own existence like a cell, with their own social, legal, institution and technical walls around themselves, but then arguably unable to cooperate or collaborate with others. They just die and wither off. And I wonder why it is that all the time and the energy and the money that I see being spent on these projects, on these high-risk projects, is not going into the projects that we know have been living and working and to some extent evolving over the last 2 to 3 decades, which is the LETs and the time banks, which is where I've chosen to put my energy. And what we have instead is these isolated individual projects attempting in their own way to take on a globalized capitalist payment network embodied in the banking system. And they start off by saying, well, we've got 15 users and you can pay them with this currency which we issued out of nothing, so it's not really backed. But hopefully when enough people start circulating it, it'll be trusted. It's very often the reasoning. And there's just no way you can compete or even stand alongside the globalized banking network with that kind of approach. And if we were to think in terms of building a multicellular organism, we could be considerably stronger by tapping into existing systems, both existing payment systems and existing exchange networks in terms of being able to advertise to each other. And possibly maybe build something that complements the global money system in a meaningful way. The scaling, therefore, is held back by the absolute borders that I mentioned before around each cell, I believe. I mean, I can't prove it because we don't have any data about what happens when all of these things come together in a proper, meaningful way.
5 minutes.
But we need to remove those borders between the systems and start thinking about building a public infrastructure. Moving swiftly on. So thinking about building a critical mass. I've used a galaxy formation metaphor here, where as the universe condenses, things come together and they cluster, and when something gets heavy enough, it starts attracting other things. And so what I've been trying to do with Jem and other people that I believe and feel closely with is to build a center of gravity. And so that center of gravity so far involves everything I've done in building Community Forge, where we have 250 active LETs and time banks, all working together and somewhat interoperable on the same software. Tim Jenkin from CES, in 2015, CES had 75,000 transactions between 18,000 registered users. And slightly separately and slightly included in that is Annette Luden, who runs the CES in Australia, which is a separate technical platform, but connected. And so the three of us are representing all of these communities and all of these users, and we're saying we want to have a common technical roadmap, and we want to build deeper interoperability and build something that's greater than the sum of its parts, and to build infrastructure for the complementary currency movement. And in that, we've been most generously assisted and supported by Stephen de Millionaire, hands up, and Jem here, and several other people who I'm not going to name right now. And so it is in the act of building public infrastructure that we hope to thwart the Uber future of complementary currencies. So in order to follow up on this, there are many ways, and Jem and I are involved in many activities. First of all, I'd like to mention what Stephanie Rearick is doing. She's at the back of the room with the mutual aid networks. And that's all about bringing people together to work on projects that are common to the needs of the whole movement. She's doing a workshop tomorrow. Stephen de Millionaire is doing a workshop also tomorrow on the Community Currency Alliance. And then Jem and I will give another session on Saturday on the Credit Commons Collective and more specific proposals, because I haven't talked anything about what we're actually going to do. After the conference, there's a hackathon, which is initiated by Rogelio here. I can't say any more about that right now. Jem and I will both be in Greece with Tom Greco, who I'm sure many of you know, in June. And he's running a workshop in Kalikalos, a sort of eco-village place near to Volos, where the TEM currency was very famous. Please read my Credit Commons white paper. Please do the Money and Society MOOC, which Jem and I created. And then there's my blog and my Twitter account there. So I've been as quick as I can. I hope we have some time for questions and discussion.
Yes, you do. Thank you.
I have a social platform.
No.
Hi. Hola. Hi, Matt. I have a social platform made with Ruby on Rails and with a database with MySQL. I'm interested in knowing how to integrate my platform and very other platforms with any kind of technology. So, being a concrete, how we could do it. I have heard about Ethereum. I have heard about, for example, in Ruby on Rails, there are games of blockchain. But how can we do this integration between platforms?
So thank you for asking. In the next session, I'll be giving some more, not exactly technical, but what I call the politics of software view of things, which will give some more details. And then in the hackathon, we'll get right down to REST APIs and do what we can in 3 days.
Great, and I have a very big expectative with the hackathon. I hope it could be like a startup weekend or something like that. Is like to have a concrete challenges and maybe the time to spend good time, maybe all the night or all the weekend. I don't know, but it would be great to have this experience of integration of technologies.
Okay, Matt has been very nice at mentioning the hackathon. We will have a discussion session on Saturday in which we will discuss the challenges and so on. But Pep has brought some photocopies in which you can get some preliminary information of what kind of ateliers and so on. I leave that here so that you may pick this up to get the preliminary information, not to steal more time to this session.
Anyone else? Other questions? Yeah.
Just because the previous sessions were quite a lot to do with blockchain, I'm wondering if you could talk about how you see a migration path or a future integration, or how the previous talks are relevant to what you're talking about.
To me, as someone who's trying to build social systems, the question of should we use a blockchain is a merely technical matter, and one that we're not ready to ask yet, not least because we don't have any blockchain programmers or money to pay for them. But I would point out that the whole blockchain paradigm is about trustlessness, and I want to be working in a community and an economy in which there is trust. My reaction to the failure of the banking system, the failure of trust in the banking system, is not to say, well, we need to build trustless systems. It's to say, well, I want to do business with people I trust. And so blockchains do have a lot of interesting value to offer, and I look forward to considering them very seriously, but it's not a question for right now. And thanks for your question.
Coming from a social science background, I'm really interested to hear your perspective on this, and I would want to grab your paper as well, which would be really good. But I think I just want you to sort of elaborate around the idea of bringing community currencies together, which does seem quite sensible from a kind of a higher level perspective. But my experience of the ones in the UK is that we haven't really cracked it yet. And even if some of the bigger ones that are more well known in the UK, if we all kind of came around and started using their model, how do we reduce the chance that we're sort of just replicating failure, and we don't, if we all go towards the same model, possibly having different models allows you to sort of work out different sort of social economic contexts in different local areas, and how do you sort of avoid that?
I'm not proposing one model.
I know, yeah.
I'm proposing a shared infrastructure, and the infrastructure would be neutral as to what models anybody wants to build. And also, it would be very important to me that the issuance of any credit-like instruments would be decentralized in each local community, but then that credit would be interoperable between those local communities. So you still say these are local currencies and local credit, but they're not confined to that locality.
Oh, okay.
I think an interesting metaphor might be, we heard earlier today about all the different currencies in Argentina during the crash from Georgina. Just imagine if every one of those currencies decided to set up its own paper mill and its own printing press. Then you wouldn't get very far. So what we're talking about more is that underlying infrastructure. It's digital in this case, but then it can be applied through all manner of different ways.
And who in this movement is responsible for infrastructure, or should be responsible for infrastructure, when everyone is building their own walled garden? That's the rhetorical question.
Mary from Let's Link UK. I just want to say that the Let's model is not a stuck model. It's capable of development, and it is being developed.
Thanks. Anyone else?
Thank you. I mean, you guys both know me, but for the audience, said Morrison from Ithaca, New York. What do you guys think about something like Bancor protocol or a blockchain type protocol standard where that opens up this interoperability potential?
So, as more of an observer rather than working at the coalface as a programmer and serving communities, I can see there's a great responsibility on people like Matthew and Tim Jenkin and Annette that they don't make choices of software which would remove the autonomy of their users and would create any dependence, particularly when their users at the moment are not having to pay anything whatsoever to be on the systems they use or to process a transaction. So you've got to be very careful about what systems you're using if that then introduces transaction fees or locks you into something which you can't then get out of. So they've got to be this is the politics of software choices. So those questions need to be kept in mind when you're looking at any new initiative, whether it's trust lines or bank or anything else.
And what we would seek to do, rather than make specific software selections, is define the APIs. So to define the exact functionality that needs to happen between all the moving parts of the systems. And then it doesn't matter what software goes on each side of the API.
Okay, thanks very much.